We are ANN, and this is Planet Talk.
Okay, for those just tuning in, welcome. And this is the slideshow part of this class, Basics of Archetypal Astrology. Just a little bit about me. I was raised Mormon. This was the LDS phase of my life. Mid-60s, I'm there on the left with the Eddie Munster haircut. There we are in the mid-60s, probably in Seattle, where my dad was going to grad school in English. They left the church in 1969 and started a Back to the Land commune. And you can see that the vibe had changed considerably. I still have my BYU t-shirt on there. And this is probably 1977. Here's me on the left, and my dad's partner, Karen. I had the good fortune of going to Esalen Institute in 1979 as a work scholar, and I stayed there for a year as a work scholar too. Incredible place. And I was able to meet and connect with Rick Tarnas. He was so young then, just so generous about sharing his love and enthusiasm of astrology. I never met a more turned on person. Someone described him as having a Prometheus IV. He was on fire with his discoveries about Uranus and then archetypal astrology in general. So here's Rick with his partner Yvonne Smith, I think is her last name. She's a Jungian in San Francisco, and then Stan. And another picture from Esalen, the Esalen Gardens. Many of you have read this book. This is an underrated book. I think this is one of the best introductions to astrology. I highly recommend this. It's a small book, and it really is a great initiation into the techniques that in archetypal astrology, focusing on aspects. So there are the planetary symbols. Next week, we're going to practice drawing them and the symbols for the signs as well. You should be able to draw those and recognize those. So maybe come back to the tape and take a good look at these if you don't know them already. Okay, so Rick in Prometheus the Awakener talks about three broad understandings of archetypes in Western culture. The Homeric understanding we have from the great epics at the dawn of Greek civilization, of Hellenic civilization. The gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus who would intervene in human affairs, and much of the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, that were oral poems that were passed down, are about the problems of getting on the bad side of these deities. And often it was impossible. If you honored one or chose one, you would slight one of the other ones. And it was a very difficult situation for the mortals. But the gods and goddesses lived on a transcendent plane, but they intervened in human affairs. Plato reconceived the archetypes as timeless universals that are again transcendent. His narrator Socrates in the famous dialogues talks about, for example, how all beauty in the world is an emanation or a manifestation of the archetype of the beautiful, capital B. All goodness comes from the archetype of the good, capital G. All truth comes from the archetype, the true, capital T, and so on. This view, what's called this transcendent philosophy or idealistic philosophy, is really the most important single idea in Western philosophy. Then Jung reconceived the archetypes in the 20th century primarily as psychological organizing principles within the human psyche. In his loyal Kantian way, as Tarnas phrases it, he was for a long time unwilling to postulate that the archetypes might exist outside of the human psyche. That all that we knew for sure was that they were organizing instinctual patterns, predispositions, perceptions, and so on within our beings. But then later, through his study of synchronicity, he postulated the anima mundi, the idea that the universe itself is conscious, and these archetypal forms and principles permeate both our psyche and also the universe at large. So these are three ways that we can look at archetypes, and all three of them seem to be true. At sometimes it seems like, Venus is a goddess. At other times, a metaphysical principle, and at other times, psychological principle. So the core of astrology is the alignments between the sun, moon, and planets. And if we divide the 360-degree circle by the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, that creates the conjunction, the opposition 180 degrees, trine 120, square 90, and sextile 60 degrees. And I also use quite often 4 other aspects that are considered minor aspects. So in somewhat the same way that pressing on a fret of a guitar or a certain point on a violin string changes the frequency, we could say that the alignments between the planets seem to create different chords and resonances with each other. When 2 planets are in aspect, the archetypal energies and impulses associated with them combine and interact in our experience. So, for example, Venus and Mars in aspect brings together the friendly and harmonious nature of Venus with the fiery and passionate energies of Mars. Moon aspecting Uranus combines the emotional and nurturing instincts of the moon with the liberating and rebellious impulses of Uranus. We also look at midpoints. Midpoints are operative to around 2.5 degrees, maybe 3 degrees at the most. One planet exactly halfway between 2 other planets is called a midpoint. And that combines those 3 archetypal energies in something like a weak conjunction. And it would be written as Pluto equals Jupiter-Uranus. Pluto is at the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint. I consider midpoints to be quite a bit stronger than sign or house placements. So, they are weak aspects. We see the signs and houses as more like adjectives or adverbs in astrology. They are real, but they are kind of a weaker, in most cases, level of symbolism vis-a-vis the aspects and transits.
May I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Do the latter 2 planets in which the midpoint is in between, do they have to be aspecting for the midpoint to be relevant in terms of the No, okay.
No, but it would be stronger.
Yes.
It would be stronger. And especially in a situation where, if they're in opposition, then you're going to have a T-square as well, or if it's a trine, then you're going to have 2 sextiles as well. But no, they don't have to be. This is generously shared by Rick from Cosmos and Psyche. Conjunctions, when 2 planets are together, squares 90 degrees, oppositions 180 degrees. These are called the dynamic or hard aspects. He also calls the conjunction and opposition the axial alignments. They're the most powerful. And then if the squares added to conjunctions and oppositions, these are quadrature alignments. And then the confluent or soft aspects or flowing aspects are the 60-degree sextile and the 120-degree trine. Here are the orbs that we use. Now, Rick developed all of this. These are wider orbs than in traditional astrology. For example, a conjunction. If you look at Mars and Jupiter conjunct in the sky, 15 degrees apart, out of the vast Milky Way and the heavenly space, 15 degrees, it looks like they're almost right together. And his evidence in Cosmos and Psyche is so systematically persuasive that I think he's really proven his hypothesis. So 10 to 15 degree orb, outer planet conjunctions, we would observe even up to 20 degrees at times, especially afterwards. So these orbs in world transits would apply both to the applying phase and also the separating phase of the transit. So he calls the sunset effect can occur even after a conjunction passes 15 degrees from the conjunction. We will still notice the themes associated with those archetypes activated. Squares are 10 degrees, and then sextile 5, trine 8. I use 2 degrees on these minor aspects. I don't know, there might be a case for 2.5 degrees. I wouldn't go above that, but these are also powerful. Sesquiquadrate is like a trine plus 15 more degrees. That's one way you can spot it. And a quincunx would be 5 signs apart. So 5 times 30 degrees per sign. Here's an example of a world transit, July 20th, 1969. It was the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 60s from 1960 till 72 with that 15-degree orb. In late 68 and through August 69, Jupiter conjoined the Uranus-Pluto in the sky for a triple conjunction. And then that day, incredibly, and Rick was the one who discovered that. Maybe someone noticed this beforehand, probably so, but it's the first time that I saw it in print. The moon conjoined the Jupiter-Uranus-Pluto in a quadruple conjunction. Pretty amazing. Uranus represents Promethean scientific breakthroughs. Pluto empowers and compels whatever it touches into being with enormous force. It's the sort of the powerful explosive energies that enabled the Apollo rocket to blast beyond the constraints of gravity. Jupiter amplifies and expands whatever it touches. It kind of grants success to it. And then having the moon there this was a beautiful wink at humanity from the gods and goddesses. I mean, what an amazing synchronicity. Chiron Legrais in the archetypal cosmos has a pretty big chapter on this moon landing that's worth checking out. Now here's again one of Rick's diagrams. So the exact conjunction was 65, 66. This was the period that I was talking about. Saturn was also forming an opposition with the Uranus-Pluto during those years when Linda Perry was born and Sinead O'Connor. When Uranus got to within 15 degrees of Pluto, this was 1960, and I think there was some kind of a lunch protest. I think it was in late January 1960, and then it continued through until 1972 was when they left the 15-degree orb. And historians and sociologists, Rick points out, often refer to the 60s as the 60s and early 70s. We know that it went into 1972. I was living on a commune with my parents, and our commune went from 70 to 72. And the feeling in 72 was still idealistic. There were many moments of euphoria, and our morale was good in our commune for the most part. In 73, it all began to fall apart. There was a different feeling. And I usually like to mention that Neil Young's music was hugely popular right then, especially his album Harvest. And it just carried that kind of sad, poignant longing of like the sobering up time after the party, the sort of heart sick, but we will continue. There was also a Saturn-Neptune opposition right then at the end of the 60s. Why haven't other people been able to look at history in such a systematic and persuasive and intelligible way. Tarnas was the first person, in my opinion, to be able to successfully do this. It's almost like people had been looking through the telescope, but it just wasn't quite in focus. And it was one of the main reasons was the orbs weren't quite big enough to comprehend the actual time frames of these outer planet cycles. By expanding the orbs, it's like things suddenly came into focus, and then everything began to make sense. I mean, not everything, but a lot of things began to make sense. So to his credit, he was able to see that. The other major factor is that in archetypal astrology, as I said, we see the houses as a secondary or even tertiary symbol system. They're not as powerful as the aspects and transits themselves. We start with the aspect or transit, and then we may add in sign and house meanings as they either modify or confirm the essential aspect meanings. And so because we're not looking at the houses as much, birth time is not so essential. And so a person who is versed in traditional astrology, when looking at any chart, they're going to need an accurate birth time. But if you're looking at something like the 60s, when did it happen? And where did it happen? You also need an accurate place, because place, it all gets referenced to Greenwich Mean Time. So place is time, rotation of the earth. And so without a place or a time, people just can't do astrology at all. They can't even get off the ground with it. They might be able to look at one event, like Woodstock or something. So archetypal astrology evolved out of humanistic astrology, and the most important figures. Jung had a huge influence on humanistic astrology. His work was integrated into the astrological mainstream by Dane Rudhyar, by Liz Green, though with her Jungian emphasis would also have given her transpersonal elements as well. And also, people like Isabel Hickey were also major figures in humanistic psychology. It's client-centered. Astrology is an aid to psychological healing. It's not so much about predicting events, but on the meaning behind events. This is Glenn Perry's comment. How the client's own unconscious is co-creating their experience is very important. And the human striving for wholeness and self-actualization. Abraham Maslow talked about it, and psychologists like Virginia Satir. So this is a pretty good phase of astrology. This was a huge improvement over the old fatalistic astrology, which is so scary. When you read some of this old astrology, it's just like, oh man, the fear that people were living with, and the superstition. Some aspects are so positive and some are so negative. We don't see it that way. All aspects have a way that they can resolve in a positive form. And the key here is the client's own unconscious is a major protagonist in the enactment of archetypes and the form that they will take. Now, in archetypal astrology, I coined the term holotropic astrology, or suggested it in 1990 while I was living at the Pocket Ranch in California, to describe that subset of Rick's archetypal astrology, which specifically looks at psychedelic and holotropic states. So that was an important part of archetypal astrology, which Rick hasn't published too much on that, in the Shift Network lectures and so on. But that was really how he first got into astrology. We'll talk more about that, was looking at his transits, doing major inner journeys in the hills of Big Sur. And he was using it to pick good days for sessions, and he thought a lot about astrology in his sessions. He had a lot of insights, and also to look at sessions he had already done as a way of integrating and understanding them. And then he would then go down, and he had an entire set of Encyclopedia Britannica, no computers back then, and he would be just spending a lot of his free time looking up people's birth dates and casting their charts. And then that's how the psychological work branched out into the understanding of human culture. I remember he mentioned that he had a session once with, I believe, transiting Mars square natal Pluto, if I'm not mistaken. And he mentioned that he was gritting his teeth, and there was a very willful, and he felt that he had maybe overdone it with the sort of jaw compressions and so on. And then he looked up George Patton's birth chart. And Patton, I believe, is born with a Mars square Pluto, the famous American tank general who was an effective general, you could say, but he was also known for ruthlessness and kind of brutality and sort of lack of mercy toward his own men and so on. So that same archetype. So there's an example of how you can get an insight in a session and then see expressions of that same energy in culture and history. So integration of Groff's research, importance of the basic perinatal matrices and the full spectrum of transpersonal experiences. Jung is considered the first transpersonal theoretician in Western depth psychology. He did not use that term. Groff coined it in 1968, but he studied many transpersonal elements, the archetypal unconscious and the historical unconscious, but not all of them. Jung didn't write about reincarnation, for example, would be one example, and we'll talk about other ones. The value of holotropic states of consciousness, the intrinsic healing direction of our own inner healer. This is what makes psychotherapy possible. Our own inner healer is trying to move us toward wholeness, is trying to help us to face our unconscious, unprocessed traumas. And we are simply cooperating with the direction that is already trying to happen. And so, like Jung, Groff is very optimistic. Freud was pessimistic. He believed the best you could get was a compromise between the demands of the id, mainly sexual and aggressive, and the pressures from the id and the demands of society that people, behave themselves, that they act in a civilized manner. And that was not a very happy compromise for Freud. But Jung was much more optimistic. He felt our psyches are moving toward wholeness, and that are moving toward the archetype of the self and the value of numinous experiences. These would have a meta-healing value in people's dream lives when they reached this numinous feeling, the feeling of something that is sacred, something that is spiritual. Groff shared the optimism of Jung even more so. Jung seemed to maintain a fear all of his life of, full surrender into his unconscious. He always felt that it was important to have a strong ego, otherwise we could be sort of submerged or swallowed up by the contents of the unconscious. Jung was born with Sun square Neptune, of course, and that might fit in some ways his sense of the Neptunian unconscious could swallow up the individuality of the Sun. But Groff realized that it's actually much safer than people understand to go into these holotropic states and completely surrender to the unconscious. You don't have to maintain your ego structure. The key elements are a safe set and setting where you can completely let go for the duration of that session, and then the presence of support, ideally a male and a female. You can hold their hands if you need to get human contact, and that will help you to come back and take in nourishment. So Groff was even more optimistic than Jung. Now, astrological meanings are multivalent and multileveled. there are no symbols that manifest in a unvarying one-to-one way. There's always a range of possible expressions, and they can manifest in many different ways at the same time. And so when we look at a chart, the goal is not to find so many precise factors that we finally get the exact information on the treasure map, and then we can say this is what's going to happen. No astrologer can, through astrology alone, make that kind of an assessment. And it's generally not helpful anyway. You don't want to pin people to a certain outcome. You know, the goal is self-knowledge. The goal is self-exploration. And so Tarnas archetypal astrology is non-fatalistic and non-deterministic. The archetypes are complexly multivalent and multidimensional. They take different forms in different situations and at different times in our lives. They can manifest in a wide range of possible expressions while still being true to their basic thematic character. So the shorthand description of this is from Rick is astrology is archetypally predictive rather than concretely predictive. So we can predict the many essential characteristics of a historical epoch or an individual life experience. But the specific concrete expression that will manifest will remain indeterminate. And some of the factors that will then come into play are cultural context, free will, our co-creative participation, and unmeasurables such as karma and grace. And I've added in here, this wording is quite similar to the wording that Rick uses in Cosmos and Psyche. Many of you will recognize it. And beautiful writing, but I just pulled this out of my head, but it's essentially almost verbatim Tarnas. But I added in universal mind's desire for variety of experience. So here's an example. A woman with a strong Sun square Mars natal aspect. In 2020, there are so many ways that can show up in Western civilization, Western culture in a positive way. She's likely to be fiery, enthusiastic. She might be interested in sports. She could be adventurous, love to start things, like to get out and meet life head on, kind of grab life by the horns. So those are wonderful, virtuous potentials. But let's say a woman in Saudi Arabia, in a traditional Sunni house or family has that aspect. That might be quite a difficult aspect to have because she's going to get a lot of pushback from the males and probably many of the females around her for that assertive energy. So you can see how the cultural context makes such a difference. Great. So it's really wonderful to be back, and quite intense times. High drama. That Jupiter-Pluto is connected so much with the sense of high drama, and Jupiter amplifies all the Plutonic themes of power struggles, and for many, Trump standing on the veranda of the White House looked just something right out of Mussolini or any number of kind of tin pot dictators. So that was a wild scene there. Okay, so the issue of misnamed planets is very important, especially as it pertains to all the new asteroids that are being discovered. So let me just talk about Uranus and Neptune first. Uranus was named Uranus because it was the next planet out from Saturn, and Uranus was the father of Kronos, Saturn in mythology. So just as Saturn, Kronos was the father of Zeus, Zeus Jupiter, and is the next planet out from Jupiter, the astronomers of the time just wanted to keep with that tradition, so they named it Uranus. But Tarnas in Prometheus the Awakener makes a very convincing case that Uranus was misnamed. Now, I really recommend that book. I think it's the best beginner book on archetypal astrology, Prometheus the Awakener. And he suggests that the figure of Prometheus is a more accurate fit. Prometheus was the rebel titan who stole fire from the gods and goddesses, and fire is a symbol for culture, for science, technology, learning, medicine, and by giving that to humanity, he improved the lot of suffering, shivering humanity. And for that, he was punished by being chained to the Caucasus Mountains, where an eagle fed on his liver every day, though the liver regenerated. And this is a nice, accurate fit with the effects of Uranus in our human life. Rebellion, moments of genius, creative originality and inspiration, and the technological and scientific breakthroughs of humanity. Tarnas, shows how for example, the Jupiter-Uranus cycle has an amazing correlation with quantum leaps in technological breakthroughs, moments of illumination. The Prometheus archetype is granted king or queen. That's Jupiter during Jupiter-Uranus alignments. On the other hand, Uranus was a static father figure. He was something that represented the status quo, and he was a figure that needed to be rebelled against, just the opposite of the nature of Uranus. So I think that's a very convincing case. I don't think we need to rename the planet. I don't see it happening, but I think just looking at the mythology of Uranus, I would say gives us really no insight into the meaning of the transiting Uranus or natal Uranus. Now, regarding Neptune, I had the good fortune of being at Esalen in 1980, and Rob Hand came, and I did a weekend workshop with him, and it was a fascinating experience. What a fun mind he has. He was so passionate about astrology, and was doing different experiments with us and so on. And on the Saturday evening, Rick, Tarnas, and I and Rob drove to Nepenthe in Big Sur and had a Mexican dinner. And they each ordered a beer. And I remember thinking, wow, spiritual people can drink a beer too. This was early on in my life, and I'd grown up with beer drinking rednecks, and then went to Esalen. And so it struck me as as a kind of a healthy sign, in moderation, of course, unless you're an alcoholic. But the conversation was fascinating. They were talking about how Neptune was misnamed. Now, there is a formal similarity between Poseidon, Neptune in Greek mythology, and the archetype Neptune. They both have to do with the water in some way. Neptune, of course, or Poseidon, lives in the water, and Neptune is a kind of watery, oceanic archetype. But the similarity ends there. Poseidon was the brother of Zeus, and he was essentially a storm god. He was always angry, vengeful. The whole story of the Odyssey is about getting on the bad side of Poseidon. Odysseus slighted him in some way, and then the crew of the Calypso was subject to his wrath and vengeance and storms for 10 years as they were trying to get back to Ithaca, if I'm not mistaken. And so the archetype Neptune, on the other hand, is not vengeful and storming at all. It's serene, it's quiet, it's peaceful. It's not always pleasant. There's a negative side to Neptune, like in toxic womb experiences, the negative side of BPM-1. But when we experience BPM-1 experiences, they still have a serene quality. There's a kind of a suffering, but it's a quiet, deeply internalized suffering, as opposed to BPM-2 can have this apocalyptic feeling, and BPM-3 we're usually thrashing around and yelling and choking, throwing up, and it's very dynamic and active. So, to hear them talk about that was very impressive to me. Here is a tenet of modern astrological understanding, the names of these planets. Okay, so this is Rick Tarnas' natal chart here, and his transits in around the period of the winter solstice, 1978, when he made the discovery that Prometheus was the closer fit with the planet Uranus. Does anybody see anything there that stands out, in terms of the transits?
Pluto on Neptune.
Okay. Yeah. Any other?
Yeah, I see Uranus square Jupiter and Pluto. So, well, yeah, first of all, the Uranus Jupiter, bringing in like you said, like crowning Prometheus, and this. I don't know. I feel like when Uranus comes in, it's going to plug us into whatever archetype we're talking about. So, this big awakening gift, right? And also the intensity of Pluto, like this earth shattering kind of cataclysmic opening of something new.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, I agree with you. Uranus was lighting up his natal Jupiter-Pluto opposition. We'll be looking at his chart as we go in this course. But, the Uranus-Jupiter in particular is these sort of sudden dramatic breakthroughs. Jupiter amplifying the Uranian Promethean archetype of new discoveries, sudden insights, and so on. So yes, I think that's right on. The transiting Jupiter, also opposition Mercury, can lead to mental understanding, far-seeing perspective, and so on. So we'll certainly be looking more at Rick's chart. So the issue of asteroids, I talk about that in O Goddess, and many of you have probably seen my sort of introduction to that. The return of the feminine in human civilization is probably the single most important thing that is happening. It is one of the meta trajectories in Western civilization and human civilization. And in astrology, an important way that the feminine is being reintegrated and re-honored is the discovery of thousands of new asteroids. We have to remember, though, two things. One is the feminine wants to be and needs to be seated at the highest head table of the gods and goddesses. And to me, the asteroids are, because they're so small, are kind of like a secondary category of astronomical body. An additional way that the feminine can be integrated into this head table of the deities is by recognizing that the Greco-Roman names of many of the planets are masculine, but the essential meanings of the planetary archetypes transcend gender. They have both masculine and feminine qualities, feminine and masculine qualities. So the problem is that the planets were given masculine names because of the patriarchal bias of the Greeks and Romans. Not that the planetary archetypes are inherently masculine. And so I guess I could just briefly go down these, but the sun does have a yang quality, certainly, and it's that positive vitality and inspiration and creative life spark in each of us, in female and males and people who identify as non-gendered. Apollo is a good fit. Atman, the Hindu concept of the individual self, is a good fit. There's also a solar deity in Japanese Shinto mythology, Amaterasu. Amber Balk talked about her, kind of brought her to my attention. Now, the moon is, connected with yin qualities of connection, belonging, family, community, and so on, emotion. Demeter, Isis, these are two of the most famous mother goddesses in human history. They still surface very often in people's sessions in holotropic and psychedelic states. These goddesses are alive and well in the collective pantheon. And we now have access to the entire pantheon of humanity from all times past. Parvati is another one, or Mary. There's a Babylonian male lunar god, Nannar, who is another possibility there. Now, Mercury, this is actually, I didn't update this one, I apologize. I've got Mercury Muses here. Mercury Metis is what I put in the book. Metis was the Greek goddess of measurement. So, Mercury is a pretty good fit. Metis would be a feminine version. Now, Venus was a pretty good fit with the archetype Aphrodite. Adonis was, considered the most beautiful male and was a very Venusian male. Also, Narcissus was a Greek figure who embodies some of the negative qualities of Venus: self-infatuation, vanity. He stared at his reflection in a pool so long, and he paid no attention to anything else. Now, Mars, and the archetype Mars is a pretty close fit with the mythological Aries Mars, but Athena is a wonderful feminine version of that Mars archetype. Jupiter, Lakshmi, the Hindu goddess of prosperity and abundance, is a wonderful expression of our planetary archetype, Jupiter. I don't think the planets will be misnamed, but this is something that all students should look at, in my opinion, as a kind of a corrective. Now, Saturn, Kronos was a pretty good fit. But also Maya. Now, Maya has two parts. Maya is the sort of the illusion of the material world, but Maya is also Neptunian in the sense that in the Hindu understanding of Maya, there are many realities or levels of reality that are much higher than the one that most of us see as exclusively real. So it's both Saturn and Neptune. But the small r reality is very much Saturnian. And so Maya is a good fit there. The Moirai were the three fates in Greek mythology, and at all times and frequently in the Greek writing, they were described as being higher even than Zeus. They were considered the highest powers in the universe, these three goddesses or feminine principles. Clotho, I can't remember, the last one was Atropos and the first one was Clotho. Our word cloth, she spun the fabric of life. Atropos cut the yarn at the end of the life. It's connected with our word atropine, something that's released in the body when we die. So Moirai are also a good fit for Saturn. As we were talking about last time, the idea of the fates, Moirai mean the fates, the three fates. This only goes as far as the perinatal layer of the unconscious, though, because fate only goes as far as individual consciousness, right? At the transpersonal levels of consciousness, when we have transpersonal experiences, we can identify with the entire universe, for example. And at that point, what is the fate of the universe? It's these kind of ideas don't apply on that level. Now, we've talked about Prometheus being a better fit, and Uranus really has very little to do with the archetype Uranus as we know it in astrology. Persephone, the rising, the goddess of spring, who went into the underworld and then was reborn in the spring, is a wonderful fit for Uranus, a feminine version. Now, Neptune, Samadhi, This is the Hindu concept of entering into states of unity, waking up to the connection with the all. Muses are another wonderful fit here, rather than in Mercury, where I originally had it. The muses were the forces for the Greeks that granted artistic and literary inspiration. And so from the imaginal realm that grant us with these creative gifts. So that's a wonderful fit. They were all female. Yeah, great. So that's a wonderful addition then to Neptune. And then Brahman, this is different than Brahma, the Hindu creator god. Brahman was the Hindu concept of the universal soul. It's not a male or female, transcends all duality. So Atman Brahman was the Hindu term for recognizing that our individual self or individual soul is really the universal soul. We don't really exist as a separate being. So Atman equals Brahman is the shorthand for that realization. And then the Tao is the Chinese or Taoist way of describing the universal field of consciousness that is within all things. And then Pluto's a pretty good fit with Hades, Pluto, but Kali is equally good, or Shiva. So Kali Shiva or Shiva Kali. So for those of you who haven't read Old Goddess, I just wanted to talk about those. So multivalent mythological figures. So we just looked at how a single planetary archetype could have a number of mythological or spiritual fits. Now, looking at it from the other direction, a single mythological figure can have a number of astrological corollaries. So we need to start thinking more as kind of open-minded scientists in astrology, and not just, something is named that way so all of our information can be got by looking at the mythology. Just to backtrack slightly. So in the issue of asteroids, there's two issues for me with the asteroids. One is, or three, the return of the feminine is absolutely crucial for our human civilization. Planets can be misnamed, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that asteroids could be misnamed as well. I think it may take several generations of systematic observation for us to confirm, or possibly in some cases to modify, the asteroid mythology correlations. So just keep that in mind. And then the other issue is that the feminine is equal to the masculine principle in every way. I mean, but there's a higher level where they don't even exist. That transcends all gender and duality. But at the level of feminine and masculine, or yang and yin, the feminine is equal to the masculine, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that these planetary archetypes have both feminine and masculine components. So here we go. This is from Tarnas' unpublished manuscript, Prometheus the Awakener. It was sort of his prototype that became basically all three of his books. Pieces of it went into that. But he talks about Zeus, for example, embodies at least 4 planetary archetypes. Jupiter, in his role as the grand and benevolent king of the gods on Mount Olympus. In Greek mythology, Zeus also has Saturnian qualities as the jealous tyrant father who condemns Prometheus to be chained on a rock in the Caucasus Mountains for stealing fire. He has a Uranian or Promethean quality. That's a little confusing, but a Uranian quality in his tricking of and liberation from being devoured by his father Kronos. And he has a Plutonic quality as a rapist and inseminator of mortal beings on Earth. So here's one mythological figure that has at least 4 astrological archetypes embodied in his nature. You've all seen that, this perinatal sequence. Our friend and holotropic breathwork colleague Eva Ursini drew this hybrid drawing of, this is the baby from Stan's BPM4, and I wanted something with that included the mother. Now, Stan's BPM4 here emphasizes the biological separation from the mother. So see, this is the umbilical cord that's been cut, and part of an important component of BPM4 is that we are now a distinct biological entity, separation from the mother. He's not talking about like, separation anxiety separation. It's that biological separation. And it's similar to Jung's idea of individuation, of becoming your own person out of the herd mentality, out of the conformist realm, but becoming an individual, that Uranian quality. But there's an even equally fundamental aspect of BPM4, which is the reconnection with the divine, as the divine feminine, the divine masculine, or the divine in a more abstract way, like radiant light. So I really love this. And I put this together. I'm sure, yeah, you've all seen this before. The BPMs have an obstetric component, but even more important component of the BPMs are the archetypal qualities associated with them. We'll be talking a lot about that through this course. And you can even eliminate the obstetric diagrams and just look at the BPMs as archetypes. Now, this is quite interesting in the case of elective cesarean people, and there are more and more of them, right? I mean, Stan didn't work with any elective cesarean babies, I don't think, in his early clinical work. But now it's what, like 30% or something like that in the United States. It seems like people who were born by elective cesarean can still have many of the perinatal experiences. They won't have the obstetric components. They are not going to have, maybe like the feeling of pelvic bones jammed into their head, things like that. But all of the transpersonal components of the perinatal matrices will still be organized in their psyche and can come out during transits. So during heavy Pluto transit, they're liable to get the aggressive elements, feeling of titanic struggle related to BPM3, but it would show up as ancestral memories of struggle and violence, racial and collective memories of struggle and violence, mythological sequences involving destruction and so on, the sadomasochistic, the demonic, the scatological, and the pyrocathartic, all of those elements associated with BPM3, they all have transpersonal manifestations as well. And so it seems like when people go into deep experiential therapy who were born by elective cesarean, the experiences they have will kind of mirror what their birth would have been like. The basic patterns are still there. Like you can see people yelling, fighting, raging feelings, and so on. And that wasn't caused by life-threatening suffocation in the birth canal, like it would be for a vaginal delivery, but they would be in touch with all the rage from things that happened in their ancestral, racial, or species history, and so on. This is a big question, and one we'll come back to. And maybe some of you who are elective cesareans can share things as we go. Now, you've all seen this. I posted this last year when I posted this for the first time, because I only saw it last year. It was in Stan's The Way of the Psychonaut. Said he stared at it for a long, long time. Right, Art? Yeah, it is a very very concise schema or model. It contains a lot of wisdom and insight here. This is a remarkable drawing. I'm not even sure who created this, whether a friend of the Groffs or a friend of Rick Tarnas. But here we've got ordinary ego consciousness at the top, and then the personal unconscious. Now this is as far as Freud got, and the basic components of the personal unconscious are in basic agreement with Freud's understandings, except for the notable omission of the psychotraumas around medical problems like surgeries, accidents, illnesses. These also leave a trace in the psyche. Freud and no other psychological school have integrated those yet. The one exception that Groff mentions is L. Ron Hubbard in Dianetics. Hubbard was aware of the effect of those kind of traumas. And Groff, I think, gives Hubbard his due as a theoretician, but he distinguishes that from the whole behavior of the Scientology organization, which seems to be much more about control and money and so on. So he in one of his books calls Dianetics a gold mine of insights. So that's something to keep in mind. But they weren't able to successfully apply that knowledge, I don't believe, in a systematic way with people. E-meters, they have this kind of lie detector that they hook people up to, and they try to look where the emotional charge is as they're asking them these questions, and then lead people toward that charge so they can process it out. But that's verbal therapy, and that is in no way adequate for processing out the contents of the unconscious. It just can't happen. So then the perinatal layer of the psyche with these 4 BPMs, and then the influence of the birth chart and the astrological archetypes, perinatal memories, and then comes the transpersonal unconscious with these major categories of ancestral memories, karmic memories, past life experiences, collective memories. So we can have sequences in psychedelic sessions of things that happened in our family, our racial line, or sort of like our family ancestry would be direct ancestors. Then our racial line, we all have many racial lines, obviously, right? And they all end up converging when you go back far enough. And then collective memories are the memories of everybody else, and they're all important. Like you can have Caucasians can have memories of Africans in the slave trade, and even though they have no direct lineage, those kind of things leave just as much trauma in the collective unconscious, as ones that are directly affected their own family lines, right? So we have access to the experience of all humanity from all time. Phylogenetic memories are, of course, proto-human memories. Like I've begun to have these now in my cannabis sessions, and I've had a few lately of the our mammalian ancestors, these rodents who lived in holes in the ground during the era of the dinosaurs, and how there was a kind of a perinatal quality of having to live in holes and living in fear, but the maternal impulse and the paternal impulse to take care of and keep life going, kept our ancestors going for, tens of millions of years. And then issues around the Terra birds and how they were dinosaurs that basically survived in South America, what is now South America, and were the top of the food chain, and how mammals were terrified of them. And then how at a certain point, big cats, it was actually when North and South America joined, the Panama Isthmus joined at a certain point. I guess sea levels dropped, and then big cats from North America got into Latin America and wiped out all the big terror birds, and the shock for those birds, of like the end of a sort of dynasty. So these are phylogenetic memories, and I'm starting to have those, and it's really interesting. The stuff starting to surface for me. So, and then the archetypal dimension. Below that would be the universal mind, you know, this sort of unitive, the cosmic creative principle that sort of bifurcates and divides itself into archetypal principles. So there's a deeper layer, deeper than the archetypes. And what this schema shows is the coex systems of condensed experience. Now, you've all probably listened to my recording about Groff's expanded cartography already. He found that when memories begin to surface in psychotherapy, they don't emerge randomly and haphazardly, but tend to emerge in clusters of experience, which are connected by a similar emotion or a similar sensation. So a similar emotion would be something like shame and ridicule or humiliation. People could, in sessions, relive some events that happened in their lifetime, then childhood, and then it would go back to like BPM 2 or 3. It would have a strong perinatal component, and then there might be a transpersonal component as well, something that happened in a past life or a collective memory. We can also have coexes connected by a physical sensation rather than an emotion. And the example that Groff has actually observed is somebody experienced they were playing in the sand as a child, and they were digging a tunnel, and it collapsed and they almost died. And so there was a feeling of suffocation that they relived. And then the deeper root of this was the choking in BPM 3, the dynamic stage of labor. And then they relived even deeper than that, past life of being hanged on the gallows. And so our symptoms, our problems and conflicts have these chains of memories underlying them. And in order to have resolution in effective psychotherapy, we have to be given the opportunity to experience all the layers of that coex system underlying the symptoms. And our own inner healer will present that. We don't have, as a therapist, we don't have to guide the client there. We just offer them a safe environment and some sort of a catalyst, whether it's deep breathing or a psychedelic substance, and let their own intrinsic healing intelligence select the material for that session. That's the most we can do as a therapist. That's the most help you can give to someone, is to give them that opportunity. And if they need support in facing it, and they ask for a hand to hold on to or a hug, you give it unconditionally, and do body work at the end if they're unresolved, and so on, and have a good integration with a loving social environment with their friends and family. So what an amazing depiction here. And this is valuable because astrology is essentially about the human psyche. I mean, this whole side of archetypal astrology that I call holotropic astrology, Rick Tarnas created this field. He initiated it, but I suggest that as one possible name. In holotropic astrology, we look at experiences in non-ordinary states or holotropic and psychedelic states, including dreams. But if we're studying archetypal astrology in history, like current events and patterns in history, which is what Tarnas has published in Cosmos and Psyche, the influence of the psyche is always still there, right? Mass movements that bring out perinatal feelings in masses of people and so on. Nietzsche called psychology the mother of the sciences, of all sciences. And I believe that psychology is the way forward for humanity.